Hello void and all who inhabit it, it's me. And after this video, you should check out my sister in hiatus, Aishayo, who recently posted a video she's been working on for the greater part of a year. If you're familiar with the channel, you might have noticed that I love Gothic literature. So imagine my delight when I had the opportunity to watch 3 films inspired by Frankenstein within the span of a month. Well, 2, and then I was reminded of the 3rd. That these 3 films were released relatively close to each other is probably a coincidence, but I went into each viewing experience wondering why Frankenstein right now. I want to acknowledge early in this video that these films are 3 different tones in 3 different, somewhat overlapping genres. I'm not going into this semi-analysis expecting each film to handle their topics with the same amount of weight, but rather examining 3 different takes of the same story, now with the woman at the center, whether as the creator or the creature. Like I said, I had this question of why are we adapting this story right now? And with gender now featuring heavily into the narrative. And I thought it might be interesting to peel back some motivation beyond, I like this story and wanted to make my own version. Anyway, if you're interested in this month's hyperfixation, grab a snack and strap in. Before we get to the films, we have to start with the source material. Frankenstein by Mary Shelley is an 1818 novel about a scientist who robs several graves for parts in order to assemble and animate a collaged corpse, which he does successfully before immediately abandoning it. Frankenstein, who is the scientist, not the creation, then spends the entire novel running from the creature until he, the creation, catches up with Frankenstein in Antarctica. Despite cinematic interpretations, the creature in Shelley's novel is also pretty intelligent and has his own portion in the book in which he struggles with acceptance and desires for revenge. The novel is generally recognized as a fundamental piece of Gothic literature, but for the scope of this conversation, it's worth noting that Frankenstein perhaps is even more influential in its role in the creation of the female Gothic. A quick note, I do want to recognize that the restrictive and at times essentialist nature of the term the female Gothic has been criticized by scholars over time. I didn't find an agreed upon updated term, and within the source I was using, the authors still referred to the subgenre as such, so I will be doing so as well. The female Gothic is described as one of the earliest critical manifestations of the change in the consciousness that came out of the women's liberation movement of the late 1960s. The theorization of the female Gothic identified it as a genre that expressed women's dark protests, fantasies, and fears. Given that Frankenstein explores the burden and responsibility of creation, a lot of literary analysis of the novel that considers gender focuses on motherhood and birthing and other Freudian adjacent examinations, all of which makes sense and arguably all started with Ellen Moores in the 70s. Moores, who coined the term female Gothic, identified 2 types of female Gothic novels. Shelley's turn of genre in Frankenstein, described as very powerfully a birth myth, and Anne Radcliffe's origination of a mode in which the central figure is a woman who is simultaneously a persecuted victim and courageous heroine. While Frankenstein is a strong launching point, I want to start with the second aspect of the female Gothic, the persecuted and courageous protagonist, as an archetypal structure that continues to prove useful, especially for the batch of films we're looking at today. Starting with Bella Baxter of Poor Things. The creature of the narrative, Bella Baxter is reanimated when Godwin Baxter transplants the brain of her unborn child back into her. It's a weird sentence, but work with me. The bulk of the story follows Bella as she stumbles out into the world and tries to make an identity with her newfound agency and brain. Both the film and the novel it's based off of are a fantastical adaptation of Frankenstein set in a surrealist Victorian London, and both were written by men. I'm mentioning this because I don't want to restrict these films to the foundational female Gothic definition of literature by women, but I do want to consider how these protagonists are presented as persecuted and courageous through a gendered lens, which I think means examining how gender is explored through the author's interpretation or the protagonist's story, if not both of those things. In this case, although self-actualization is a major aspect of the story, and Bella is surrounded by men, the impact of the male gaze on her development is hardly explored within Poor Things. It's audacious that, as a character who loves sex and needs money, Bella decides to become a sex worker and takes on every client, even a father who asks her to have sex in front of and then with his young sons without shame. It's a similar shamelessness as exhibited in her pursuit of pleasure and information that causes Bella to be perceived as a threat by the men she encounters. We get a really clear understanding that the men in Bella's life like her most when they can infantilize or objectify her, but how that impacts the way Bella views herself isn't examined as much. Connected to this, the existence of other women within these spaces is barely considered. It seems odd that within a story about a woman coming into being, that we see her interacting so little with other women. There are 3 major women in Bella's story that each serve shallow, singular purposes. Firstly is Martha on the cruise ship, to whom Bella's first words are something along the lines of, "We gotta get you some dick," before Martha in turn introduces Bella to, I don't fucking know, Plato or something. When she starts working in the brothel, Bella has one impactful conversation with Madame Swiney about choice and labor. Madame Swiney tells her that in order to know the world, we have to know everything, including degradation. That for the greater good, we have to work even if we don't like it. All as a justification as to why the working women don't get to choose which clients they sleep with. And at the end of her story, Bella is in some kind of companionship with Tanette, a fellow sex worker who had perhaps a total of 15 lines in the whole film. In comparison, Harry, who Bella met at the same time as Martha, has a greater on-screen and narrative impact than Martha and Tanette combined. Harry introduces Bella to a pessimistic understanding of social hierarchies through this shameless exercise where he takes her to see the suffering people of Alexandria and explains to her that there will always be somebody at the bottom. This exercise has so great of an impact on Bella that it leads her to a decision that sets off the next major chunk of the story. Tanette similarly introduces Bella to a philosophical viewpoint, so I guess she has 2 purposes, my bad. But Tanette's lessons on socialism happen by taking Bella to these meetings we never see. Bella just suddenly now quotes Marx and Engels. Martha's encouragement of philosophical engagement on the cruise ship is the briefest, but it had the most potential. I was flippant earlier, but Martha tells Bella to stop reading Emerson and pick up Goethe, a philosopher who introduced the concept of the eternal feminine. It's a reference that perhaps only a philosophy major would have caught on the first watch, but it's a shame that the story doesn't spend more time with this ideal of femininity through an amalgamation of other women, even if it's just to negate it, because it would have added a really interesting aspect that seems inherent to this character's story. We also have the opportunity to have this conversation once we're introduced to Felicity, who Godwin and Max reanimate in hopes of making another Bella, but we never see the 2 women talk. There's no bending of the rules of this already wacky reality to accelerate Felicity's consciousness to maybe explore some connecting thread of women so trapped and restricted and alone that they turn to death as an escape. There's no effort to consider community among women as powerful as individual intellectual elevation. Bella is not a one-off thing, but someone experiencing something that can connect to other people experiencing the same. But instead, we take narrative time to follow Bella's former lover throwing a tantrum. Bella is certainly persecuted and courageous, but with so few interactions with other women as equals, it appears that she is perhaps the only woman that fits this description in her story. The angry black girl and her monster runs into a similar issue. Another adaptation of Frankenstein, The Angry Black Girl and Her Monster follows Vicaria, a brilliant teen girl determined to beat the disease of death through reanimation, starting with her brother. Vicaria is a grieving girl desperate for reconnection. Bomani J. Story, the writer-director, is a fan of Frankenstein, and perhaps one of the few people who remembers that Victor, the protagonist of the novel, was impacted by his mother's death, leading to everything that resulted in the reanimated creation in the first place. Story's protagonist, Vicaria, is similarly forged by the death of her mother at a young age, though her death is from a drive-by, not scarlet fever. Regardless, Vicaria is a precocious young girl persecuted for such. This is shown most vibrantly in a scene that low-key doesn't make sense. My initial recollection of this got the scene backwards, and in rewatching it to pull these clips, it actually makes a little less sense. But anyway, Vicaria is interrupting her teacher during a lesson, and the teacher keeps cutting her off and eventually disengages from the conversation to just call a security officer down to her classroom, to which Vicaria understandably is like, what the hell? The teacher says, I gave you a warning. You can walk to detention by yourself, or you can wait for the security officer to come take you. Then mispronounces her name, calls her Vicaria. Vicaria corrects her, and the teacher says, well, I'm just going to call you Vicky because it's easier. Vicaria responds, well, I'm just going to call you Miss Bitch since we're not not calling anybody by their actual name. The teacher then starts screaming at her to get out. Around this time, the security officer shows up as well, and Vickaria is refusing to leave. The officer escalates an already escalated situation by yanking her out of her chair, slamming her to the ground, and breaking her glasses in the process of removing her from the classroom. This scene doesn't work for me for two reasons. One, Vickaria goes to a shishi pom-pom school. They would not have a resource officer. The public school, with the strict-ass dress code and the metal detectors at the front door, would have a rent-a-cop eager to abuse a child, not what seems to be the playground for America's next top capitalist. Secondly, and perhaps most importantly, this scene so blatantly feels like a choice of a visual reference that's meant to be jarring, rather than doing something to build character or explore theme. I have this issue with the film in general. At times it feels like we aren't exploring, but rather just stamping a message on the viewer's forehead. When it comes to establishing Vickaria as persecuted, we only have this scene at the school. I'm gonna guess that story, as in the writer-director, wasn't operating with the female Gothic in mind, but I think it's important that there's only this singular, heavy-handed portrayal as Vickaria as persecuted, because the death that she is trying to eradicate, the source of persecution, is primarily only seen affecting men and boys. Vickaria and the other women and girls in the neighborhood are impacted by death, yes, but the disease of death isn't infecting them. Similarly to Poor Things, the angry black girl and her monster suffers from a no other woman exists type of situation, where the other women and girls in Vickaria's neighborhood, when we do see them, are kind of just like Vivica A. Fox's character from Don't Be a Menace to South Central while drinking your juice in the hood, not really rounded, which is important when considering Vickaria's role in her own story. She's positioned as a morally gray savior within a narrative that hardly ever questions what she's doing or why. Nor does the story consider, at the very least, how its female protagonist is impacted by the systemic things she's trying to eradicate, other than, again, being like the loved one of somebody who has been affected by XYZ thing. A loner determined to fix a problem, Vickaria is barely challenged even by the gang leader whose product she steals. Beyond this, in story moments where Vickaria could or should be bearing the brunt of what's happening, she's an observer or not even participating. She's persecuted in name only. Despite this, I will say that Vickaria is pretty strongly shown as courageous, given that she's consistently challenging power structures with her teacher and the gang leader. And that's more than can be said of the protagonist of Lisa Frankenstein. Lisa Swallows is a lonely goth girl desperate for a connection who leaves trinkets at the grave of a long-dead bachelor. When he is reanimated by a random lightning storm, they work together to source parts to complete his new body. Is Lisa courageous? I mean, she's a murderer, or at least an accomplice. At any rate, I guess that requires some courage. Beyond this, Lisa grows more bold over the course of the story, from wallowing in her loneliness to relishing in her strangeness, which arguably is courageous. It's perhaps because of this arc that Lisa's persecution is acutely felt. Similar to Vickaria, Lisa witnessed her mother's death, this time at the hands of an axe murderer. However, Lisa's story goes a step further to consider how death impacts the way people perceive survivors, and how at times that perception is not one of kindness. Lisa isn't really met with sympathy. In fact, her stepmother Janet uses what happened as a reason to question Lisa's story later in the film. When the creature shows up and tears through the house, Janet claims that the destruction was all made up by Lisa, who liked the attention of her mother's attack and is trying to get more. During the press run for the film, writer Diablo Cody mentioned that Lisa Frankenstein takes place in the same universe as Jennifer's Body. I didn't see the impact of that, but the comment made me wonder if this film was also an allegory to SA. I don't think it is, at least not as blatantly as Jennifer's Body was, but there's some similar language used, namely again in this moment with Janet, which I think is interesting. This lack of sympathy continues, however, outside of the home, wherein Lisa is treated like a social pariah, a source of town gossip for similar reasons. It's a simple exile for the final of our female Gothic protagonists, a set of courageous and persecuted women and girls. However, Moore's definition reminds us that the female Gothic story can exist with or without a heroine. As the text that connects these all, Frankenstein features a male protagonist. So although I find this archetype of the heroine to be an interesting framework, the key to all female Gothic stories is the exploration of women's protests, fantasies, and fears. I think at first glance, Vicaria's story most closely returns to the birth myth analysis of Frankenstein, and as an extension would fit this description the most easily. But as mentioned before, the narrative doesn't question Vicaria's actions and motivations. Looking at fears and protests as expressed explicitly by women and girls doesn't just mean a woman or girl is saying the thing. It's a consideration of the intersection of gender in this narrative. In The Angry Black Girl and Her Monster, said intersection doesn't happen because the impact of many parts of the story on the protagonist isn't at the forefront. There's a scene late in the film that exemplifies this. The creature, trying to take the place of Vicaria's brother Chris, interacts with Vicaria's father Donald and scares the shit out of him. It's a moment that feels very ripped from Frankenstein, the creation reckoning with the reality that the creator will never accept him. But Donald is not his creator. Vicaria is. Having this major moment of reckoning for the creature happen with a character who is simultaneously meeting him for the first time felt like undercutting Vicaria's weight in her own story. It also removes the chance to examine how Vicaria feels about creation. She remains unchanged over the span of the story, vindicated if anything when she has to resurrect a whole family in the final scene. Her wants, her fears, even her initial desire to beat death in a systemic metaphorical way are all abandoned. At best, there is this consistent message of you are who keeps the community alive, wherein the presentation of duty feels very gendered, but still only at a surface level. There's a scene where Vicaria is getting her hair braided by her brother's girlfriend Aisha, and one of Aisha's siblings calls the other one a bitch. Aisha then scolds the boy child for this by saying something along the lines of, when you call one girl a bitch, you call us all that. Is that what you want? We have these very on the nose, very message type of moments, specifically for men and boys. Meanwhile, the women and girls are kind of relegated to set dressing or the vehicle through which the message is presented, but not someone who needs or deserves or gets a message of her own. I know there are stories where someone's marginalized identity marker isn't a hindrance or a big deal, and there's also great worth in just having a marginalized character be without identity being a part of the story. But The Angry Black Girl and Her Monster high-key doesn't fit into this category of film because of choices connected to racial commentary. It's a shame that intentional choices didn't carry over when thinking about gender in the story. Poor Things is a bit better in its understanding of gender with the way control and restriction are explored. Bella is consistently protesting against the legion of men who are trying to wrangle her. On Twitter, some people were like,
the men want her because she has a baby brain and that's gross.
And like, yeah, that's the point. These men are interested in someone submissive and nubile, and the moment Bella pushes past that, the moment she starts to build on her own, it's a problem for these men. But again, this is why it's so disappointing for me that we don't see Bella interacting with Felicity. There's so much potential in a conversation around building a sense of self that goes beyond the wants of those who wish to consume you. There's so much to pull from when talking about identity construction that rejects or works to stop considering the male gaze. But instead, we have this whole side story of Duncan Idaho, or whatever his name is, spiraling out of control and finding any way to see Bella punished. We spend time laughing at a man who is the embodiment of the larger issue being critiqued, when we could have spent time with the women building senses of identity that go beyond grand philosophical poetic waxings. It's kind of like, I thought we were going to do something interesting. I'm also a bit iffy on the fantasy presented through Bella, not the environment of the story, but what fantasies she is engaging in. There's maybe the fantasy of getting to start over, but Bella is more so a blank slate who gets to have sex endlessly and learn about philosophy. It's a fantasy that doesn't feel as accessible as Lisa's. Lisa fantasizes about a solution to a familiar teenage level of loneliness. What's odd about Lisa's story is how that loneliness is addressed. She has a Build-A-Boyfriend dropped into her living room and then has to kill people to, fix him up or whatever. But the initial loneliness feels familiar. Again, I'm not saying Bella's story or even Vicaria's needed to be relatable in its specifics, but rather in looking at the exploration of its themes, which I think takes us quite choppily to why now? part of the why now answer is money. Always. Studios may want to appeal to a certain demographic through pandering, but they want to do so safely to ensure maximum profits. This film only gets to exist because it's proven to be worth the risk insofar that it's not that risky at all. Part of that non-risky risk is choosing a film that's an adaptation or a retelling because there is comfort in a story that we've seen before and themes that we recognize, but with something extra on top. When we add the intersection of gender, there's the promise that because this protagonist is now a woman or a girl, these thematic explorations will change. The familiar made different. However, disappointment arises when a promise is all that happens, when these premises don't actually consider how gender identity impacts these stories or these characters. Prime example, Lisa has something that Vicaria and Bella don't: a platonic relationship with another girl or woman who is her equal. It's important that, in a story where the main character is driven by loneliness, the narrative sets up someone, beyond a love interest, who cares about her. In part because whiny characters are annoying, but also because through this, the story refuses to fulfill the protagonist's desire to wallow in her own self-pity and thus creates a point of growth. Or you can take the American fiction route of having consequences for a character that wallows. Regardless, Lisa's relationship with Taffy takes this idea of pushing the wallowing protagonist to grow a step further by directly challenging an expectation that the prettier, naive girl is automatically the villain, or that Lisa would be justified in viewing her as such. So we've taken this familiar setup, the wallowing protagonist and the companion who cares, and we've used it to apply something different through the lens of gender. But such a choice requires an understanding that there is this competitive dynamic between women in film in the first place, that such a dynamic could easily exist between your characters and could be directly pushed against. Which anyone can write, right? You don't have to be a woman to recognize that women need to be rounded characters. But Poor Things and The Angry Black Girl and Her Monster seem to only be interested in their protagonist genders as shock points or marketing aspects, not as something that dynamically impacts the root of their arcs and stories. Poor Things' understanding of gender is only presented through sex, the power and weight and burden and expectations connected to being a woman having sex with men. It's shallow, not because of the exploration of sex, but because it's really only that. How, for example, does Bella, as the mama who is the baby, feel about motherhood? It's a simple question, one you would think would be at the forefront when we learn the truth that we don't ever get answered or asked. When Bella decides to live with her past self's husband, she learns that his plan is to subdue her through female genital mutilation. Not pregnancy, not a lobotomy, not even a combination, but an attack of her literal physical sex. It's an egregious form of control and one that seems to understand the female orgasm as the only form of liberation in a story that low-key does the same. Again, it's not that it's bad that we explored this, it's just kind of shallow. One note, as for The Angry Black Girl and Her Monster, the title suggests that the film is challenging two things. One is the perception of monstrous blackness, which I think we see quite clearly with the creation story, all the way to it ending with Vicaria saying, "He's not a monster, he's Chris." But the second, the anger of black girlhood, isn't in the story. This is a tangent, but stay with me. The Netflix series Fool Me Once has an excellent example of the specific intersection of girlhood and grief. Prior to the start of the series, a side character is murdered. We then get to see how her family is processing that death, and specifically, there is a scene where her teenage daughter is eating. The father enters the room and he asks her, "Did you make any for me?" The girl snaps back at him, "I'm your daughter, not your wife." It's such a small thing, but there's a clear understanding that the impact of a mother's death on a girl child, especially a teenager, can be more than carrying grief. It can mean carrying the weight of a role you didn't opt into. I'm not saying Vicaria's story had to look exactly the same, and arguably with her taking care of her father who's suffering with addiction, there are moments of this, but rather I'm questioning, how does death and loss change Vicaria's life beyond creating this obsession? How does the death of her mother weigh as heavily as that of her brother? I don't think I would have minded as much that we don't get as many moments examining that aspect, the aspect of her mother's death and the impact on her and her loss of childhood, if this film was not a retelling of a source text wherein the layering of these two identity markers, Blackness and girlhood, are meant to bring something new. The addition of Blackness to this story is clear. The addition of girlhood is not. And honestly, I think low-key, there might be less interest in what these films actually do than there is in what they present the opportunity for. In an interview about Lisa Frankenstein, writer Diablo Cody was asked about Poor Things and what she thought about the two films coming out close to each other. And she said something along the lines of, the idea of creating life is never going to get old. Creating life is more than just birth myths. Lisa and Vicaria are drawn by the appeal of creating some sense of agency and control in a world where they are losing both. They are interested in recreating their lives as they know them. Bella is both a creation and a creator of her own identity. While there's room to question how successful these films are, they are at least attempting something more than what we always see, to be a non-risky risk where the familiar can be made different. If you made it to the end, thank you for making it to the end. Whew, I'm recording in my living room. Oh, and I have 11 messages. So excuse the echo. Have you seen these films? What are you watching in general? I've had Murder, She Wrote on as background noise, and that show is wild, girl. A dog inherited a whole estate in one episode. It was giving Knives Out. I was worried for the dog. But I've also been watching films, and I'm pleased to announce that I have thoughts around 2 more video ideas already. Please hold your applause. The one I'm willing to share is a look at the Magical Negro movie in comparison to American fiction. I know Yara recently posted a review of the Magical Negro movie, and I'm trying not to watch that video so that I don't faint my thoughts. To be honest, getting to watch that is fueling me to write this a little faster, so fingers crossed it's less than 6 months before the next video. Anyway, I should get to writing that. So that's all from me. Until next time, stay safe. I'll catch you in the next episode.